Chapter 11 of The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey. Chapter 11. The savage had just emerged from the river, for his graceful copper-colored body and scanty clothing were dripping with water. He carried a long bow and a quiver of arrows. Brandt uttered an exclamation of surprise, and Metzar a curse, as the lithe Indian leaped the brook. He was not young. His swarthy face was lined, seamed, and terrible with dark impassiveness. "Pale-face, brother, get arrow," he said in halting English, as his eyes flashed upon Brandt. "Chief, want make sure." The white man leaned forward, grasped the Indian's arm, and addressed him in an Indian language. This questioning was evidently in regard to his signal, the whereabouts of the others of the party, and why he took such fearful risks almost in the village. The Indian answered with one English word: "Deathwind." Brandt drew back with drawn white face, while a whistling breath escaped him. "I knew it, Wetzel," he exclaimed in a husky voice. The blood slowly receded from Metzar's evil, murky face, leaving it haggard. "Deathwind on Chief's trail up Eagle Rock," continued the Indian. "Deathwind fooled not for long. Chief wait pale-face brothers at 2 islands." The Indian stepped into the brook, parted the willows, and was gone as he had come, silently. "We know what to expect," said Brandt in calmer tone, as the daring cast of countenance returned to him. "There's an Indian for you. He got away, doubled like an old fox on his trail, and ran in here to give us a chance at escape. Now you know why Bing Legget can't be caught." "Let's dig at once," replied Metzar, with no show of returning courage as characterized by his companion. Brandt walked to and fro with bent brows, like one in deep thought. Suddenly he turned upon Metzar eyes which were brightly hard and reckless with resolve. "By heaven, I'll do it! Listen. Wetzel has gone to the top of Eagle Mountain, where he and Zane have a rendezvous. Even he won't suspect the cunning of this Indian. Anyway, it'll be after daylight tomorrow before he strikes the trail. I've got 24 hours and more to get this girl, and I'll do it." "Bad move to have weight like her on a march," said Metzar. "Bah, the thing's easy. As for you, go on, push ahead. After we're started, all I ask is that you stay by me until the time to cut loose." "I ain't a-goin' to crawfish now," growled Metzar. "Strikes me, too, I'm losing more'n you." "You won't be a loser if you can get back to Detroit with your scalp. I'll pay you in horses and gold. Once we reach Legget's place, we're safe." "What's your plan about getting the gal?" asked Metzar. Brandt leaned forward and spoke eagerly, but in a low tone. "Get away on horseback?" questioned Metzar, visibly brightening. "Well, that's some sense. Can ye trust the other party?" "I'm sure I can," rejoined Brandt. "It'll be a good job, and all done in daylight, too. Bing Legget couldn't plan better," Metzar said, rubbing his hands. "We've fooled these Zanes and their fruit-raising farmers for about a year, and our time is about up," Brandt muttered. "One more job and we're done. Once with Legget we're safe, and we'll work slowly back towards Detroit. Let's get out of here now, for some one may come at any moment." The plotters separated, Brandt going through the grove and Metzar down the path by which he had come. Helen, trembling with horror of what she had heard, raised herself cautiously from the willows where she had lain and watched the innkeeper's retreating figure. When it had disappeared, she gave a little gasp of relief. Free now to run home, there to plan what course must be pursued. She conquered her fear and weakness, and hurried from the glade. Luckily, so far as she was able to tell, no one saw her return. She resolved that she would be cool, deliberate, clever, worthy of the borderman's confidence. First she tried to determine the purport of this interview between Brandt and Metzar. She recalled to mind all that was said and supplied what she thought had been suggested. Brandt and Metzar were horse thieves, aides of Bing Legget. They had repaired to the glade to plan. The Indian had been a surprise. Wetzel had routed the Shawnees, and was now on the trail of this chieftain. The Indian warned them to leave Fort Henry and to meet him at a place called Two Islands. Brandt's plan, presumably somewhat changed by the advent of the red man, was to steal horses, abduct a girl in broad daylight, and before tomorrow's sunset escape to join the ruffian Legget. "I am that girl," murmured Helen shudderingly, as she relapsed momentarily into girlish fears, but at once she rose above selfish feelings. Secondly, while it was easy to determine what the outlaws meant, the wisest course was difficult to conceive. She had promised the borderman to help him, and not speak of anything she learned to anybody himself. She could not be true to him if she asked advice. The point was clear. Either she must remain in the settlement, hoping for Jonathan's return in time to frustrate Brandt's villainous scheme, or find the borderman. Suddenly she remembered Metzar's allusion to a second person whom Brandt felt certain he could trust. This meant another traitor in Fort Henry, another horse thief, another desperado willing to make off with helpless women. Helen's spirit rose in arms. She had their secret. She could ruin them. She would find the borderman. Wetzel was on the trail at Eagle Rock. What for? Trailing an Indian who was then 5 miles east of that rock. Not Wetzel. He was on that track to meet Jonathan. Otherwise, with the redskins near the river, he would have been closer to them. He would meet Jonathan there at sunset today, Helen decided. She paced the room, trying to still her throbbing heart and trembling hands. "I must be calm," she said sternly. "Time is precious. I have not a moment to lose. I will find him. I've watched that mountain many a time, and can find the trail and the rock. I am in more danger here than out there in the forest. With Wetzel and Jonathan on the mountainside, the Indians have fled it. But what about the savage who warned Brandt? Let me think. Yes, he'll avoid the river. He'll go round south of the settlement, and therefore can't see me cross. How fortunate that I have paddled a canoe many times across the river. How glad that I made Colonel Zane describe the course up the mountains." Her resolution fixed, Helen changed her skirt for one of buckskin, putting on leggins and moccasins of the same serviceable material. She filled the pockets of a short, rain-proof jacket with biscuits, and, thus equipped, sallied forth with a spirit and exultation she could not subdue. Only one thing she feared, which was that Brandt or Metzar might see her cross the river. She launched her canoe and paddled downstream under cover of the bluff to a point opposite the end of the island, then straight across, keeping the island between her and the settlement. Gaining the other shore, Helen pulled the canoe into the willows and mounted the bank. A thicket of willow and alder made progress up the steep incline difficult, but once out of it she faced a long stretch of grassy meadowland. A mile beyond began the green, billowy rise of that mountain she intended to climb. Helen's whole soul was thrown into the adventure. She felt her strong young limbs in accord with her heart. "Now, Mr. Brandt, horse thief and girl snatcher, we'll see," she said with scornful lips. "If I can't beat you now, I'm not fit to be Betty Zane's friend, and I am unworthy of a borderman's trust." She traversed the whole length of the meadowland, close under the shadow of the fringed bank, and gained the forest. Here she hesitated. All was so wild and still. No definite course through the woods seemed to invite, and yet all was open. Trees, dark, immovable trees everywhere. The violent trembling of poplar and aspen leaves, when all others were so calm, struck her strangely, and the fearful stillness awed her. Drawing a deep breath, she started forward up the gently rising ground. As she advanced, the open forest became darker and of wilder aspect. The trees were larger and closer together. Still she made fair progress, without deviating from the course she had determined upon. Before her rose a ridge, with a ravine on either side, reaching nearly to the summit of the mountain. Here the underbrush was scanty. The fallen trees had slipped down the side, and the rocks were not so numerous, all of which gave her reason to be proud, so far, of her judgment. Helen, pressing onward and upward, forgot time and danger. While she reveled in the wonder of the forest land, birds and squirrels fled before her. Whistling and wheezing of alarm, or heavy crashings in the bushes, told of frightened wild beasts. A dull, faint roar, like a distant wind, suggested tumbling waters. A single birch tree, gleaming white among the black trees, enlivened the gloomy forest. Patches of sunlight brightened the shade. Giant ferns, just tingling with autumn colors, waved tips of sculptured perfection. Most wonderful of all were the colored leaves, as they floated downward with a sad, gentle rustle. Helen was brought to a realization of her hazardous undertaking by a sudden roar of water, and the abrupt termination of the ridge in a deep gorge. Grasping a tree, she leaned over to look down. It was fully 100 feet deep, with impassable walls, green-stained and damp, at the bottom of which a brawling brown brook rushed on its way. Fully 20 feet wide, it presented an insurmountable barrier to further progress in that direction. But Helen looked upon it merely as a difficulty to be overcome. She studied the situation, and decided to go to the left, because higher ground was to be seen that way. Abandoning the ridge, she pressed on, keeping as close to the gorge as she dared, and came presently to a fallen tree lying across the dark cleft. Without a second's hesitation, for she knew which would be fatal, she stepped upon the tree and started across, looking at nothing but the log under her feet, while she tried to imagine herself walking across the Watergate, at home in Virginia. She accomplished the venture without a misstep. When safely on the ground once more, she felt her knees tremble, and a queer, light feeling came into her head. She laughed, however, as she rested a moment. It would take more than a gorge to discourage her, she resolved with set lips, as once again she made her way along the rising ground. Perilous, if not desperate, work was ahead of her. Broken, rocky ground, matted thicket, and seemingly impenetrable forest rose darkly in advance, but she was not even tired, and climbed, crawled, twisted, and turned on her way upward. She surmounted a rocky ledge to face a higher ridge covered with splintered, uneven stones and the fallen trees of many storms. Once she slipped and fell, spraining her wrist. At length this uphill labor began to weary her. To breathe caused a pain in her side, and she was compelled to rest. Already the gray light of coming night shrouded the forest. She was surprised at seeing the trees become indistinct, because the shadows hovered over the thickets, and noted that the dark, dim outline of the ridges was fading into obscurity. She struggled up on the uneven slope with a tightening at her heart, which was not all exhaustion. For the first time she doubted herself, but it was too late. She could not turn back. Suddenly she felt that she was on a smoother, easier course. Not to strike a stone or break a twig seemed unusual. It might be a path worn by deer going to a spring. Then into her troubled mind flashed the joyful thought. She had found a trail. Soft, wiry grass, springing from a wet soil, rose under her feet. A little rill trickled alongside the trail. Mossy, soft-cushioned stones lay embedded here and there. Young maples and hickories grew breast-high on either side, and the way wound in and out under the lowering shade of forest monarchs. Swiftly ascending this path, she came at length to a point where it was possible to see some distance ahead. The ascent became hardly noticeable. Then, as she turned a bend of the trail, the light grew brighter and brighter until presently all was open and clear. An oval space covered with stones lay before her. A big, blasted chestnut stood near by. Beyond was the dim purple haze of distance. Above, the pale blue sky, just faintly rose-tinted by the setting sun. Far to her left, the scraggly trees of a low hill were tipped with orange and russet shades. She had reached the summit. Desolate and lonely was this little plateau. Helen felt immeasurably far away from home, yet she could see in the blue distance the glancing river, the dark fort, and that cluster of cabins which marked the location of Fort Henry. Sitting upon the roots of the big chestnut tree, she gazed around. There were the remains of a small campfire beyond a hollow under a shelving rock. A bed of dry leaves lay packed in this shelter. Someone had been here, and she doubted not that it was the borderman. She was so tired and her wrist pained so severely that she lay back against the tree trunk, closed her eyes, and rested. A weariness, the apathy of utter exhaustion came over her. She wished the borderman would hurry and come before she went to sleep. Drowsily she was sinking into slumber when a long, low rumble aroused her. How dark it had suddenly become! A sheet of pale light flared across the overcast heavens. "A storm!" exclaimed Helen. "Alone on this mountain top with a storm coming? Am I frightened? I don't believe it. At least I'm safe from that ruffian Brandt. Oh, if my borderman would only come!" Helen changed her position from beside the tree to the hollow under the stone. It was high enough to permit of her standing upright, and offered a safe retreat from the storm. The bed of leaves was soft and comfortable. She sat there, peering out at the darkening heavens. All beneath her, southward and westward, was gray twilight. The settlement faded from sight. The river grew wan and shadowy. The ruddy light in the west was fast succumbing to the rolling clouds. Darker and darker it became, until only one break in the overspreading vapors admitted the last crimson gleam of sunshine over hills and valley, brightening the river until it resembled a stream of fire. Then the light failed, the glow faded. The intense blackness of night prevailed. Out of the ebon west came presently another flare of light, a quick, spreading flash like a flicker from a monster candle. It was followed by a long, low, rumbling roll. Helen felt in those intervals of utterly vast silence that she must shriek aloud. The thunder was a friend. She prayed for the storm to break. She had withstood danger and toilsome effort with fortitude, but could not brave this awful, boding wilderness stillness. Flashes of lightning now revealed the rolling, pushing, turbulent clouds, and peals of thunder sounded nearer and louder. A long, swelling moan, sad, low, like the uneasy sigh of the sea, breathed far in the west. It was the wind, the ominous warning of the storm. Sheets of light were now mingled with long, straggling ropes of fire, and the rumblings were often broken by louder, quicker detonations. Then a period, longer than usual, of inky blackness succeeded the sharp flaring of light. A faint breeze ruffled the leaves of the thicket and fanned Helen's hot cheek. The moan of the wind became more distinct, then louder, and in another instant, like the far-off roar of a rushing river, the storm was upon her. Helen shrank closer against the stone, and pulled her jacket tighter around her trembling form. A sudden, intense, dazzling, blinding white light enveloped her. The rocky promontory, the weird giant chestnut tree, the open plateau, and beyond, the stormy heavens, were all luridly clear in the flash of lightning. She fancied it was possible to see a tall, dark figure emerging from the thicket. As the thunderclap rolled and pealed overhead, she strained her eyes into the blackness, waiting for the next lightning flash. It came with brilliant, dazzling splendor. The whole plateau and thicket were as light as the day. Close by the stone where she lay crept the tall, dark figure of an Indian. With staring eyes she saw the fringed clothing, the long flying hair, and supple body peculiar to the savage. He was creeping up on her. Helen's blood ran cold. Terror held her voiceless. She felt herself sinking slowly down upon the leaves. End of chapter 11. The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey, Chapter 12. The sun had begun to cast long shadows the afternoon of Helen's hunt for Jonathan, when the borderman, accompanied by Wetzel, led a string of horses along the base of the very mountain she had ascended. "Last night's job was a good 'un. I ain't against sayin', but the redskin I wanted got away," Wetzel said gloomily. "He's safe now as a squirrel in a hole. I saw him dartin' among the trees with his white eagle feathers stickin' up like a buck's flag," replied Jonathan. "He can run. If I'd only had my rifle loaded.
but I'm not sure he was that arrow-shooting Shawnee." "It was him. I saw his bow. We oughter taken more time and picked him out," Wetzel replied, shaking his head gravely. "Though maybe that'd been useless. I think he was hidin'. He's precious shy of his red skin. I've been after him these 10 year and never ketched him nappin' yet. We'd have done much toward snuffin' out Legget and his gang if we'd winged that Shawnee. He left a plain trail. One of his tricks. He's slicker on a trail than any other Injun on the border. Unless maybe it's old Wingenund, the Huron. This Shawnee'd lead us many a mile for nothin' if we'd stick to his trail. I'm long ago used to him. He's doubled like an old fox, run harder'n a skeered fawn, and if it needs be, he'll lay low as a cunnin' buck. I calculate once over the mountain, he's made a bee line east. We'll go on with the hosses, and then strike across country to find his trail." "It 'pears to me, Lew, that we've been takin' a long time in makin' a show against these hoss thieves," said Jonathan. "I ain't sayin' much, but I've felt it," said Wetzel. "All summer and nothin' done. It was more luck than sense that we run into these Injuns with the hosses. We only got 3 out of 4, and let the best redskin give us the slip. Here fall is nigh on us, with winter comin' soon, and we still don't know who's the white trader in the settlement. I said it's be a long and maybe our last trail." "Why?" "Because those fellers, red or white, are in with a picked gang of the best woodsmen as ever outlawed the border. We'll get the Fort Henry hoss thief. I'll back the Bright Eyed Lass for that." "I haven't seen her lately, and allow she left word if she learned anythin'." "Well, maybe it's as well you hain't seen so much of her." In silence they traveled, and arriving at the edge of the meadow, were about to mount 2 of the horses when Wetzel said in a sharp tone, "Look!" He pointed to a small, well-defined moccasin track in the black earth on the margin of a rill. "Lew, it's a woman, sure you're born," declared Jonathan. Wetzel knelt and closely examined the footprint. Yes, a woman's, and no Injun. "What?" Jonathan exclaimed as he knelt to scrutinize the imprint. "This ain't half a day old," added Wetzel, "and not a redskin's moccasin near. What do you reckon?" "A white girl alone," replied Jonathan as he followed the trail a short distance along the brook. "See, she's making upland. Wetzel, these tracks could hardly be my sister's, and there's only one other girl on the border whose feet will match 'em. Helen Sheppard has passed here, on her way up the mountain to find you or me." "I like your reckoning." "She's suddenly discovered something. Injuns, hoss thieves, the Fort Henry trader, or maybe, and most likely, some plotting. Being bound to secrecy by me, she's not told my brother, and it must be called for a hurry. She knows we frequent this mountain top. Said Eb told her about the way we get here." "I'd calculate about the same." "What'll you do? Go with me after her?" asked Jonathan. "I'll take the hosses and be at the fort inside an hour. If Helen's gone, I'll tell her father you're close on her trail. Now listen, it'll be dark soon, and a storm's comin'. Don't waste time on her trail. Hurry up to the rock. She'll be there if any lass can climb there. If not, come back in the mornin'. Hunt her trail out, and find her. I'm thinkin', Jack, we'll find the Shawnee had somethin' to do with this. Whatever happens after I get back to the fort, I'll expect you hard on my trail." Jonathan bounded across the brook. With an easy lope began the gradual ascent. Soon he came upon a winding path. He ran along this for perhaps a quarter of an hour until it became too steep for rapid traveling, when he settled down to a rapid walk. The forest was already dark. A slight rustling of the leaves beneath his feet was the only sound, except at long intervals the distant rumbling of thunder. The mere possibility of Helen's being alone on that mountain, seeking him, made Jonathan's heart beat as it never had before. For weeks he had avoided her, almost forgot her. He had conquered the strange, yearning weakness which assailed him after that memorable Sunday, and once more the silent, shaded glens, the mystery of the woods, the breath of his wild, free life had claimed him. But now, as this evidence of her spirit, her recklessness, was before him, and he remembered Betty's avowal, a pain which was almost physical, tore at his heart. How terrible it would be if she came to her death through him. He pictured the big, alluring eyes, the perfect lips, the haunting face, cold in death, and he shuddered. The dim gloom of the woods soon darkened into blackness. The flashes of lightning, momentarily streaking the foliage or sweeping overhead in pale yellow sheets, aided Jonathan in keeping the trail. He gained the plateau just as a great flash illuminated it, and distinctly saw the dark hollow where he had taken refuge in many a storm, and where he now hoped to find the girl. Picking his way carefully over the sharp, loose stones, he at last put his hand on the huge rock. Another blue-white, dazzling flash enveloped the scene. Under the rock he saw a dark form huddled, and a face as white as snow with wide, horrified eyes. "Lass," he said, when the thunder had rumbled away. He received no answer, and called again. Kneeling, he groped about until touching Helen's dress. He spoke again, but she did not reply. Jonathan crawled under the ledge beside the quiet figure. He touched her hands. They were very cold. Bending over, he was relieved to hear her heart beating. He called her name, but still she made no reply. Dipping his hand into a little rill that ran beside the stone, he bathed her face. Soon she stirred uneasily, moaned, and suddenly sat up. "'Tis Jonathan," he said quickly. "Don't be scared." Another illuminating flare of lightning brightened the plateau. "Oh, thank heaven!" cried Helen. "I thought you were an Indian." Helen sank, trembling, against the borderman, who enfolded her in his long arms. Her relief and thankfulness were so great that she could not speak. Her hands clasped and unclasped round his strong fingers. Her tears flowed freely. The storm broke with terrific fury. A seething torrent of rain and hail came with the rushing wind. Great heaven-broad sheets of lightning played across the black dome overhead. Zigzag ropes, steel blue in color, shot downward. Crash and crack and boom, the thunder split and rolled the clouds above. The lightning flashes showed the fall of rain in columns like white waterfalls, borne on the irresistible wind. The grandeur of the storm awed and stilled Helen's emotion. She sat there watching the lightning, listening to the peals of thunder, and thrilling with the wonder of the situation. Gradually the roar abated. The flashes became less frequent. The thunder decreased. As the storm wore out its strength in passing, the wind and rain ceased on the mountain top almost as quickly as they had begun, and the roar died away in the distance. Far to the eastward flashes of light illuminated scowling clouds and brightened many a dark, wooded hill and valley. "Lass, how is it I find you here?" asked Jonathan gravely. With many a pause and broken phrase, Helen told the story of what she had seen and heard at the spring. "Child, why didn't you go to my brother?" asked Jonathan. "You don't know what you undertook. I thought of everything, but I wanted to find you myself. Besides, I was just as safe alone on this mountain as in the village." "I don't know but you're right," replied Jonathan thoughtfully. "So Brandt planned to make off with you tomorrow." "Yes, and when I heard it I wanted to run away from the village." "You've done a wondrous clever thing, lass. This Brandt is a bad man and hard to match. But if he hasn't shaken Fort Henry by now, his career'll end mighty sudden, and his bad trail stops short on the hillside among the graves, for Eb will always give outlaws or Injun decent burial." "What will the colonel or anyone think has become of me?" "Wetzel knows, lass, for he found your trail below." "Then he'll tell papa you came after me?" "Oh, poor papa, I forgot him. Shall we stay here till daylight?" "We'd gain nothing by starting now. The brooks are full, and in the dark we'd make little distance. You're dry here and comfortable. What's more, lass, You're safe." "I feel perfectly safe with you," Helen said softly. "Aren't you tired, lass?" "Tired? I'm nearly dead. My feet are cut and bruised, my wrist is sprained, and I ache all over. But, Jonathan, I don't care. I am so happy to have my wild venture turn out successfully." "You can lie here and sleep while I keep watch." Jonathan made a move to withdraw his arm, which was still between Helen and the rock, but had dropped from her waist. "I am very comfortable. I'll sit here with you, watching for daybreak. My, how dark it is! I cannot see my hand before my eyes." Helen settled herself back into the stone, leaned a very little against his shoulder, and tried to think over her adventure, but her mind refused to entertain any ideas except those of the present. Mingled with the dreamy lassitude that grew stronger every moment was a sense of delight in her situation. She was alone on a wild mountain in the night with this borderman, the one she loved. By chance and her own foolhardiness this had come about, yet she was fortunate to have it tend to some good beyond her own happiness. All she would suffer from her perilous climb would be aching bones and perhaps a scolding from her father. What she might gain was more than she had dared hope. Breaking up of the horse thief gang would be a boon to the harassed settlement. How proudly Colonel Zane would smile! Her name would go on that long roll of border honor and heroism. That was not, however, 1,000th part so pleasing as to be alone with her borderman. With a sigh of mingled weariness and content, Helen leaned her head on Jonathan's shoulder and fell asleep. The borderman trembled. The sudden nestling of her head against him, the light caress of her fragrant hair across his cheek, revived a sweet, almost conquered, almost forgotten emotion. He felt an inexplicable thrill vibrate through him. No untrodden, ambushed wild, no perilous trail, no dark and bloody encounter had ever made him feel fear as had the kiss of this maiden. He had sternly silenced faint, unfamiliar, yet tender voices whispering in his heart, and now his rigorous discipline was as if it were not, for at her touch he trembled. Still he did not move away. He knew she had succumbed to weariness and was fast asleep. He could, gently, without awaking her, have laid her head upon the pillow of leaves. Indeed, he thought of doing it, but made no effort. A woman's head lying softly against him was a thing novel, strange, wonderful. For all the power he had then, each tumbling lock of her hair might as well have been a chain linking him fast to the mountain. With the memory of his former yearning, unsatisfied moods, and the unrest and pain his awakening tenderness had caused him, came a determination to look things fairly in the face, to be just in thought towards this innocent, impulsive girl, and be honest with himself. Duty commanded that he resist all charm other than that pertaining to his life in the woods. Years ago he had accepted a borderman's destiny, well content to be recompensed by its untamed freedom from restraint, to be always under the trees he loved so well, to lend his cunning and woodcraft in the pioneer's cause, to haunt the savage trails, to live from day to day a menace to the foes of civilization. That was the life he had chosen. It was all he could ever have. In view of this, justice demanded that he allow no friendship to spring up between himself and this girl. If his sister's belief was really true, if Helen really was interested in him, it must be a romantic infatuation which, not encouraged, would wear itself out. What was he to win the love of any girl? An unlettered borderman who knew only the woods, whose life was hard and cruel, whose hands were red with Indian blood, whose vengeance had not spared men even of his own race. He could not believe she really loved him. Wildly impulsive as girls were at times, she had kissed him. She had been grateful, carried away by a generous feeling for him as the protector of her father. when she did not seem for a long time, as he vowed should be the case after he had carried her safely home, she would forget. Then honesty demanded that he probe his own feelings. Sternly, as if judging a renegade, he searched out in his simple way the truth. This big-eyed lass with her nameless charm would bewitch even a borderman unless he avoided her. So much he had not admitted until now. Love he had never believed could be possible for him. When she fell asleep, her hand had slipped from his arm to his fingers, and now rested there lightly as a leaf. The contact was delight. The gentle night breeze blew a tress of her hair across his lips. He trembled. Her rounded shoulder pressed against him until he could feel her slow, deep breathing. He almost held his own breath, lest he disturb her rest. No, he was no longer indifferent. As surely as those pale stars blinked far above, he knew the delight of a woman's presence. It moved him to study the emotion as he studied all things, which was the habit of his borderman's life. Did it come from knowledge of her beauty, matchless as that of the mountain laurel? He recalled the dark glance of her challenging eyes, her tall, supple figure, and the bewildering excitation and magnetism of her presence. Beauty was wonderful, but not everything. Beauty belonged to her, but she would have been irresistible without it. Was it not because she was a woman? That was the secret. She was a woman with all a woman's charm to bewitch, to twine round the strength of men as the ivy encircles the oak, with all a woman's weakness to pity and to guard, with all a woman's wilful, burning love, and with all a woman's mystery. At last, so much of life was intelligible to him. The renegade committed his worst crimes because even in his outlawed, homeless state he could not exist without the companionship, if not the love of a woman. The pioneer's toil and privation were for a woman, and the joy of loving her and living for her. The Indian brave, when not on the warpath, walked hand in hand with a dusky, soft-eyed maiden, and sang to her of moonlit lakes and western winds. Even the birds and beasts mated. The robins returned to their old nests, the eagles paired once and were constant in life and death. The buck followed the doe through the forest. All nature sang that love made life worth living. Love, then, was everything. The borderman sat out the long vigil of the night, watching the stars and trying to decide that love was not for him. If Wetzel had locked a secret within his breast and never in all those years spoke of it to his companion, then surely that companion could as well live without love. Stern, dark, deadly work must stain and blot all tenderness from his life, else it would be unutterably barren. The joy of living, of unharassed freedom, he had always known. If a fair face and dark mournful eyes were to haunt him on every lonely trail, then it were better an Indian should end his existence. The darkest hour before dawn, as well as the darkest of doubt and longing in Jonathan's life, passed away. A gray gloom obscured the pale winking stars. The east slowly whitened, then brightened, and at length day broke, misty and fresh. The borderman rose to stretch his cramped limbs. When he turned to the little cavern, the girl's eyes were wide open. All the darkness, the shadow, the beauty, and the thought of the past night lay in their blue depths. He looked away across the valley, where the sky was reddening and a pale rim of gold appeared above the hilltops. "Well, if I haven't been asleep!" exclaimed Helen, with a low, soft laugh. "You're rested, I hope," said Jonathan, with averted eyes. He dared not look at her. "Oh, yes, indeed. I am ready to start at once. How gray, how beautiful the morning is! Shall we be long? I hope papa knows." In silence the borderman led the way across the rocky plateau and into the winding, narrow trail. His pale, slightly drawn, and stern face did not invite conversation. Therefore Helen followed silently in his footsteps. The way was steep, and at times he was forced to lend her aid. She put her hand in his and jumped lightly as a fawn. Presently a brawling brook, overcrowding its banks, impeded further progress. "I'll have to carry you across," said Jonathan. "I'm very heavy," replied Helen, with a smile in her eyes. She flushed as the borderman put his right arm around her waist. Then a clasp as of steel enclosed her. She felt herself swinging easily into the air and over the muddy brook. Further down the mountain this troublesome brook again crossed a trail, this time much wider and more formidable. Helen looked with some vexation and embarrassment into the borderman's face. It was always the same, stern, almost cold. "Perhaps I'd better wade," she said hesitatingly. "Why? The water's deep and cold. You'd better not get wet." Helen flushed, but did not answer. With downcast eyes she let herself be carried on his powerful arm. The wading was difficult this time. The water foamed furiously around his knees. Once he slipped on a stone and nearly lost his balance. Uttering a little scream, Helen grasped at him wildly, and her arm encircled his neck. What was still more trying, when he put her on her feet again, it was found that her hair had become entangled in the porcupine quills on his hunting coat. She stood before him while with clumsy fingers he endeavored to untangle the shimmering strands, but in vain. Helen unwound the snarl of wavy hair. Most alluring she was then, with a certain softness on her face, and light and laughter, and something warm in her eyes. The borderman felt that he breathed a subtle exhilaration which emanated from her glowing, gracious beauty. She radiated with the gladness of life, with an uncontrollable sweetness and joy. But giving no token of his feeling, he turned to march on down through the woods. From this point the trail broadened, descending at an easier angle. Jonathan's stride lengthened until Helen was forced to walk rapidly and sometimes run in order to keep close behind him. A quick journey home was expedient, and in order to accomplish this she would gladly have exerted herself to a greater extent. When they reached the end of the trail, where the forest opened clear of brush, finally to merge into the broad, verdant plain, the sun had chased the mist clouds from the eastern hilltops and was gloriously brightening the valley. With a touch of sentiment natural to her, Helen gazed backward for one more view of the mountain top. The wall of rugged rock she had so often admired from her window at home, which henceforth would ever hold a tender place of remembrance in her heart, rose out of a gray-blue bank of mist. The long, swelling slope lay clear to the sunshine, with the rays of sun gleaming and glistening upon the variegated foliage, and upon the shiny rolling haze above. A beautiful picture of autumn splendor was before her. Tall pines here and there towered high and lonely over the surrounding trees. Their dark green, graceful heads stood in bold relief above the gold and yellow crests beneath. Maples, tinged from faintest pink to deepest rose, added warm color to the scene, and chestnuts, with their brown-white burrs, lent fresher beauty to the undulating slope. The remaining distance to the settlement was short. Jonathan spoke only once to Helen, then questioning her as to where she had left her canoe. They traversed the meadow, found the boat in a thicket of willows, and were soon under the frowning bluff of Fort Henry. Ascending the steep path, they followed the road leading to Colonel Zane's cabin. A crowd of boys, men, and women loitering near the bluff arrested Helen's attention. Struck by this unusual occurrence, she wondered what was the cause of such idleness among the busy pioneer people. They were standing in little groups. Some made vehement gestures, others conversed earnestly, and yet more were silent. On seeing Jonathan, a number shouted and pointed toward the inn. The borderman hurried Helen along the path, giving no heed to the throng. But Helen had seen the cause of all this excitement. At first glance she thought Metzer's inn had been burned, but a second later it could be seen that the smoke came from a smoldering heap of rubbish in the road. The inn, nevertheless, had been wrecked. Windows stared with that vacantness peculiar to deserted houses. The doors were broken from their hinges. A pile of furniture, rude tables, chairs, beds, and other articles were heaped beside the smoking rubbish. Scattered around lay barrels and kegs, all with gaping sides and broken heads. Liquor had stained the road, where it had been soaked up by the thirsty dust. Upon a shattered cellar door lay a figure, covered with a piece of rag carpet. When Helen's quick eyes took in this last, she turned away in horror. That motionless form might be Brandt's. Remorse and womanly sympathy surged over her, for bad as the man had shown himself, he had loved her. She followed the borderman, trying to compose herself. As they neared Colonel Zane's cabin, she saw her father, Will, the colonel, Betty, Nell, Mrs. Zane, Silas Zane, and others whom she did not recognize. They were all looking at her. Helen's throat swelled and her eyes filled when she got near enough to see her father's haggard, eager face. The others were grave. She wondered guiltily if she had done much wrong. In another moment she was among them. Tears fell as her father extended his trembling hands to clasp her, and as she hid her burning face in his breast, he cried, "My dear, dear child." Then Betty gave her a great hug, and Nell flew about them like a happy bird. Colonel Zane's face was pale, and wore a clouded, stern expression. She smiled timidly at him through her tears. "Well, well, well," he mused, while his gaze softened. That was all he said, but he took her hand and held it while he turned to Jonathan. The borderman leaned on his long rifle, regarding him with expectant eyes. "Well, Jack, you missed a little scrimmage this morning. Wetzel got in at daybreak. The storm and horses held him up on the other side of the river until daylight. He told me of your suspicions, with the additional news that he'd found a fresh Indian trail on the island just across from the inn. We went down, not expecting to find anyone awake, but Metzer was hurriedly packing some of his traps. Half a dozen men were there, having probably stayed all night. That little English cuss was one of them, and another, an ugly fellow, a stranger to us, but evidently a woodsman. Things looked bad. Metzer told a decidedly conflicting story. Wetzel and I went outside to talk over the situation, with the result that I ordered him to clean out the place." Here Colonel Zane paused to indulge in a grim, meaning laugh. "Oh, well, he cleaned out the place all right. The ugly stranger got rattlesnake mad and yanked out a big knife. Sam is hitching up the team now to haul what's left of him up on the hillside. Metzer resisted arrest and got badly hurt. He's in the guardhouse. Case, who has been drunk for a week, got in Wetzel's way and was kicked into the middle of next week. He's been spitting blood for the last hour, but I guess he's not much hurt. Brandt flew the coop last night. Wetzel found this hid in his room." Colonel Zane took a long, feathered arrow from where it lay on a bench and held it out to Jonathan. "The Shawnee signal. Wetzel had it right," muttered the borderman. "Exactly. Lew found where the arrow stuck in the wall of Brandt's room. It was shot from the island at the exact spot where Lew came to an end of the Indian's trail in the water. That Shawnee got away from us." "So Lew said. Well, he's gone now. So is Brandt. We're rid of the gang, if only we never hear from them again." The borderman shook his head. During the colonel's recital his face changed. The dark eyes had become deadly. The square jaw was shut. The lines of the cheek had grown tense, and over his usually expressive countenance had settled a chill, lowering shade. "Lew thinks Brandt's in with Bing Legget. Well, dang his black traitor heart. He's a good man for the worst and strongest gang that ever tracked the border." The borderman was silent, but the furtive, restless shifting of his eyes over the river and island, hill and valley, spoke more plainly than words. "You're to take his trail at once," added Colonel Zane. "I had best put you up some bread, meat, and parched corn. No doubt you'll have a long, hard tramp. Good luck." The borderman went into the cabin, presently emerging with a buckskin knapsack strapped to his shoulder. He set off eastward with a long, swinging stride. The women had taken Helen within the house, where no doubt they could discuss with greater freedom the events of the previous day. Shepherd," said Colonel Zane, turning with a sparkle in his eyes, "Brandt was after Helen sure as bad weed grows fast, and certain as death Jonathan and Wetzel will see him cold and quiet back in the woods." That's a border saying, and it means a good deal. I never saw Wetzel so implacable, nor Jonathan so fatally cold, but once, and that was when Miller, another traitor much like Brandt, tried to make away with Betty. It would have chilled your blood to see Wetzel go at that fool this morning. Why did he want to pull a knife on the borderman? It was a sad sight. Well, these things are justifiable. We must protect ourselves, and above all our women. We've had bad men, and a bad man out here is something you cannot yet appreciate. Come here and slip into the life of the settlement, because on the border you can never tell what a man is until he proves himself. There have been scores of criminals spread over the frontier, and some better men like Simon Girty, who were driven to outlaw life. Simon must not be confounded with Jim Girty, absolutely the most fiendish desperado who ever lived. Why, even the Indians feared Jim so much that after his death his skeleton remained unmolested in the glade where he was killed. The place is believed to be haunted now by all Indians and many white hunters, and I believe the bones stand there yet." "Stand?" asked Sheppard, deeply interested. "Yes, it stands where Girty stood and died, upright against a tree, pinned there by a big knife." "Heavens, man, who did it?" Sheppard cried in horror. Again Colonel Zane's laugh, almost metallic, broke grimly from his lips. "Who? Why, Wetzel, of course. Lew hunted Jim Girty 5 long years. When he caught him, God, I'll tell you some other time. Jonathan saw Wetzel handle Jim and his pal Deering as they were mere boys. Well, as I said, the border has had, and still has, its bad men. Simon Girty took McKee and Elliott, the Tories from Fort Pitt, when he deserted, and 10 men beside. They're all, except those who are dead, outlaws of the worst type. The other bad men drifted out here from Lord only knows where. They're scattered all over. Simon Girty, since his crowning black deed, the massacre of the Christian Indians, is in hiding. Bing Legget now has the field. He's a hard nut, a cunning woodsman, and capable leader who surrounds himself with only the most desperate Indians and renegades. Brandt is an agent of Legget's, and I'll bet we'll hear from him again. End of chapter 12. Of The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey. Chapter 13. Jonathan traveled towards the east, straight as a crow flies. Wetzel's trail, as he pursued Brandt, had been left designingly plain. Branches of young maples had been broken by the borderman. They were glaring evidences of his passage. On open ground or through swampy meadows he had contrived to leave other means to facilitate his comrade's progress. Bits of sumac lay strewn along the way, every red leafy branch a bright marker of the course. Crimson maple leaves served their turn, and even long-bladed ferns were scattered at intervals. 10 miles east of Fort Henry, at a point where 2 islands lay opposite each other, Wetzel had crossed the Ohio. Jonathan removed his clothing, and, tying these together to his knapsack, to the rifle, held them above the water while he swam the 3 narrow channels. He took up the trail again, finding here, as he expected, where Brandt had joined the waiting Shawnee chief. The borderman pressed on harder to the eastward. About the middle of the afternoon signs betokened that Wetzel and his quarry were not far in advance. Fresh imprints in the grass, crushed asters and moss, broken branches with unwithered leaves, and plots of grassy ground where Jonathan saw that the blades of grass were yet springing back to their original position, proved to the borderman's practiced eye that he was close upon Wetzel. In time he came to a grove of yellow birch trees. The ground was nearly free from brush, beautifully carpeted with flowers and ferns, and except where brushy windfalls obstructed the way, was singularly open to the gaze for several hundred yards ahead. Upon entering this wood, Wetzel's plain, intentional markings became manifest, then wavered, and finally disappeared. Jonathan pondered a moment. He concluded that the way was so open and clear, with nothing but grass and moss to mark a trail, that Wetzel had simply considered it a waste of time, for perhaps the short length of this grove. Jonathan knew he was wrong after taking a dozen steps more. Wetzel's trail, known so well to him as never to be mistaken, sheered abruptly off to the left, and after a few yards the distance between the footsteps widened perceptibly. Then came a point where they were so far apart that they could have only been made by long leaps. On the instant the borderman knew that some unforeseen peril or urgent cause had put Wetzel to flight, and he now bent piercing eyes around the grove. Retracing his steps to where he had found the break in the trail, he followed up Brandt's tracks for several rods. Not 100 paces beyond where Wetzel had quit the pursuit were the remains of a campfire, the embers still smoldering, and moccasin tracks of a small band of Indians. The trail of Brandt and his Shawnee guide met the others at almost right angles. The Indian, either by accident or design, had guided Brandt to a band of his fellows, and thus led Wetzel almost into an ambush. Evidence was not clear, however, that the Indians had discovered the keen tracker who had run almost into their midst. While studying the forest ahead, Jonathan's mind was running over the possibilities. How close was Wetzel? Was he still in flight? Had the savages an inkling of his pursuit? Or was he now working out one of his cunning tricks of woodcraft? The borderman had no other idea than that of following the trail to learn all this. Taking the desperate chances warranted under the circumstances, he walked boldly forward in his comrade's footsteps. Deep and gloomy was the forest adjoining the birch grove. It was a heavy growth of hardwood trees, interspersed with slender ash and maples, which, with their scanty foliage, resembled a labyrinth of green and yellow network, like filmy dotted lace, hung on the taller, darker oaks. Jonathan felt safer in this deep wood. He could still see several rods in advance. Following the trail, he was relieved to see that Wetzel's leaps had become shorter and shorter, until they once again were about the length of a long stride. The borderman was, moreover, swinging in a curve to the northeast. This was proof that the borderman had not been pursued, but was making a wide detour to get ahead of the enemy. 500 yards further on, the trail turned sharply towards the birch grove in the rear. The trail was fresh. Wetzel was possibly within signal call, surely within sound of a rifle shot. But even more stirring was the certainty that Brandt and his Indians were inside the circle Wetzel had made. Once again in sight of the more open woodland, Jonathan crawled on his hands and knees, keeping close to the cluster of ferns until well within the eastern end of the grove. He lay for some minutes listening. A threatening silence, like the hush before a storm, permeated the wilderness. He peered out from his covert, but owing to its location in a little hollow, he could not see far. Crawling to the nearest tree, he rose to his feet slowly, cautiously. No unnatural sight or sound arrested his attention. Repeatedly, with the acute, unsatisfied gaze of the borderman who knew that every tree, every patch of fern, every tangled brush heap might harbor a foe, he searched the grove with his eyes. But the curly-barked birches, the clumps of colored ferns, the bushy windfalls kept their secrets. For the borderman, however, the whole aspect of the birch grove had changed. Over the forest was a deep calm. A gentle, barely perceptible wind sighed among the leaves like rustling silk. The far-off drowsy drum of a grouse intruded on the vast stillness. The silence of the birds betokened a message. That mysterious breathing, that beautiful life of the woods lay hushed, locked in a waiting, brooding silence. Far away among the somber trees, where the shade deepened into impenetrable gloom, lay a menace, invisible and indefinable. A wind, a breath, a chill, terribly potent, seemed to pass over the borderman. Long experience had given him intuition of danger. As he moved slightly, with lynx eyes fixed on the grove before him, a sharp, clear, perfect bird note broke the ominous quiet. It was like the melancholy cry of an oriole, short, deep, suggestive of lonely forest dells. By a slight variation in the short call, Jonathan recognized it as a signal from Wetzel. The borderman smiled as he realized that with all his stealth Wetzel had heard or seen him re-enter the grove. The signal was a warning to stand still or retreat. Jonathan's gaze narrowed down to the particular point whence had come the signal. Some 200 yards ahead in this direction were several large trees standing in group. With one exception, they all had straight trunks. This deviated from the others in that it possessed an irregular, bulging trunk, or else half shielded the form of Wetzel. So indistinct and immovable was this irregularity that the watcher could not be certain. Out of line somewhat with this tree which he suspected screened his comrade, lay a large windfall, large enough to conceal in ambush a whole band of savages. Even as he gazed, a sheet of flame flashed over the cover. Crack! A loud sound followed, then the whistle and zip of a bullet as it whizzed close by his head. "Shawnee lead," muttered Jonathan. Unfortunately, the tree he had selected did not hide him sufficiently. His shoulders were so wide that either one or the other was exposed, affording a fine target for a marksman. A quick glance showed him a change in the knotty tree trunk. The seeming bulge was now the well-known figure of Wetzel. Jonathan dodged as some object glanced slantingly before his eyes. Twang whiz thud! 3 familiar and distinct sounds caused him to press hard against the tree. A tufted arrow quivered in the bark not a foot from his head. "Close shave! Damn that arrow-shooting Shawnee!" muttered Jonathan. "And he ain't in the windfall either." His eyes searched to the left for the source of this new peril. Another sheet of flame, another report from the windfall. A bullet sang close overhead, and glancing on a branch, went harmlessly into the forest. "Injuns all around. I guess I better be making tracks," Jonathan said to himself, peering out to learn if Wetzel was still under cover. He saw the tall figure straighten up, a long black rifle rise to a level and become rigid. A red fire belched forth, followed by a puff of white smoke. Bang! An Indian's horrible, strangely breathtaking death yell rent the silence. Then a chorus of plaintive howls, followed by angry shouts, rang through the forest. Naked, painted savages darted out of the windfall toward the tree that had sheltered Wetzel. Quick as thought, Jonathan covered the foremost Indian, and with the crack of his rifle saw the redskin drop his gun, stop in his mad run, stagger sideways, and fall. Then the borderman looked to see what had become of his ally. The cracking of the Indian's rifle told him that Wetzel had been seen by his foes. With almost incredible fleetness, a brown figure with long black hair streaming behind darted in and out among the trees, flashed through the sunlit glade, and vanished in the dark depth of the forest. Jonathan turned to flee also, when he heard again the twanging of an Indian's bow. A wind smote his cheek. A shock blinded him. An excruciating pain seized upon his breast. A feathered arrow had pinned his shoulder to the tree. He raised his hand to pull it out, but slippery with blood, it afforded a poor hold for his fingers. Violently exerting himself, with both hands he wrenched away the weapon. The flint head, lacerating his flesh and scraping his shoulder bones, caused sharpest agony. The pain gave way to sudden sense of giddiness. He tried to run. A dark mist veiled his sight. He stumbled and fell. Then he seemed to sink into a great darkness and knew no more. When consciousness returned to Jonathan, it was night. He lay on his back, and knew because of his cramped limbs that he had been securely bound. He saw the glimmer of a fire, but could not raise his head. A rustling of leaves in the wind told him he was yet in the woods, and the distant rumble of a waterfall sounded familiar. He felt drowsy. His wound smarted slightly, still he did not suffer any pain. Presently he fell asleep. Broad daylight had come when again he opened his eyes. The blue sky was directly above, and before him he saw a ledge covered with dwarfed pine trees. He turned his head and saw that he was in a sort of amphitheater of about 2 acres in extent, closed by low cliffs. A cleft in the stony wall led out a brawling brook, and served, no doubt, as entrance to the place. Several rude log cabins stood on that side of the enclosure. Jonathan knew he had been brought to Bing Legget's retreat. Voices attracted his attention, and turning his head to the other side, he saw a big Indian pacing near him, and beyond 7 savages and 3 white men reclining in the shade. The powerful, dark-visaged savage near him he at once recognized as Ashbow, the Shawnee chief and noted emissary of Bing Legget. Of the other Indians, 3 were Delawares and 4 Shawnees, all veterans with swarthy, somber faces and glistening heads on which the scalp locks were trimmed and tufted. Their naked, muscular bodies were painted for the war-path with their strange emblems of death. A trio of white men, nearly as bronzed as their savage comrades, completed the group. One a desperate-looking outlaw, Jonathan did not know. The blond, bearded giant in the center was Legget, steel blue and human eyes, with the expression of a free but hunted animal. A set mastiff-like jaw, brutal and coarse, individualized him. The last man was the haggard-faced Brandt. "I tell you, Brandt, I ain't goin' against this Injun," Legget was saying positively. "He's the best ready on the border, and has saved me scores of time. This feller Zane belongs to him, and while I'd much rather see the scout knifed right here and now, I won't do nothing to interfere with the Shawnee's plans." "Why does the redskin want to take him away to his village?" Brandt growled, all Injun vanity and pride. "It's Injun ways, and we can't do nothin' to change 'em. But you're boss here. You can make him put this borderman out of the way." "Well, I ain't goin' ter interfere. Anyways, Brandt, the Shawnee'll make short work of the scout when he gets him among the tribe. Injuns is Injuns. It's a great honor for him to get Zane, and he wants his own people to figure in the finish. Quite natural, I reckon." "I understand all that, but it's not safe for us, and it's courting death for Ashbow. Why don't he keep Zane here until you can spare more than 3 Indians to go with him? These bordermen can't be stopped. You don't know them because you're new in this part of the country." "I've been here long as you, and a-goin' some too, I reckon," replied Legget complacently. "But you've not been hunted until lately by these bordermen, and you've had little opportunity to hear of them except from Indians. What can you learn from these silent redskins? I tell you, letting this fellow get out of here alive, even for an hour, is a fatal mistake. It's 2 full days' tramp to the Shawnee village. You don't suppose Wetzel will be afraid of 4 savages? Why, he sneaked right into 8 of us when we were ambushed waiting for him. He killed one and then was gone like a streak. It was only a piece of pure luck we got Zane." "I've reason to know this Wetzel, this Deathwind, as the Delawares call him. I've never seen him, though, and always I reckon I can handle him if ever I get the chance." "Man, you're crazy!" cried Brandt. "He'd cut you to pieces before you'd have time to draw. He could give you a tomahawk, then take it away and split your head. I tell you, I know. You remember Jake Deering? He came from up your way. Wetzel fought Deering and Jim Girty together and killed them. You know how he left Girty?" "I'll allow he must be a fighter, but I ain't afraid of him." "That's not the question. I'm talking sense. You've got a chance now to put one of these bordermen out of the way. Do it quick. That's my advice." Brandt spoke so vehemently that Legget seemed impressed. He stroked his yellow beard and puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. Presently he addressed the Shawnee chief in the native tongue. "Will Ashbow take 5 horses for his prisoner?" The Indian shook his head. "How many will he take?" The chief strode with dignity to and fro before his captive. His dark, impassive face gave no clue to his thoughts, but his lofty bearing, his measured, stately walk, were indicative of great pride. Then he spoke in a deep bass. "The Shawnee knows the woods from the Great Lakes where the sun sets to the blue hills where it rises. He has met the great pale-face hunters. Only for Deathwind will Ashbow trade his captive." "See, it ain't no use," said Legget, spreading his hands. "Let him go. He'll outwit the borderman, if any redskin's able to. The sooner he goes, the quicker he'll get back, and we can go to work. You ought to be satisfied to get the girl." "Shut up," interrupted Brandt sharply. "'Pears to me, Brandt, bein' in love has kinder worked on your nerves. You used to be game. Now you're feared of a bound and tied man who ain't got long to live." "I fear no man," answered Brandt, scowling darkly. "But I know what you don't seem to have sense enough to see. If this Zane gets away, which is probable, he and Wetzel will clean up your gang."
"Oh, ho, ho, ho!" roared Legget, slapping his knees. "Then you'd have little chance of gettin' the lass, eh?"
"All right. I've no more to say," snapped Brandt. Raising and turning on his heel, as he passed Jonathan, he paused. "Zane, if I could, I'd get even with you for that punch you once gave me. As it is, I'll stop at the Shawnee village on my way west."
"With a pretty lass," interposed Legget.
"Where I hope to see your scalp drying in the chief's lodge." The borderman eyed him steadily, but in silence. Words could not so well have conveyed his thought as did the cold glance of dark scorn and merciless meaning. Brandt shuffled on with a curse. No coward was he. No man ever saw him flinch. But his intelligence was against him as a desperado. While such as these bordermen lived, an outlaw should never sleep, for he was a marked and doomed man. The deadly, cold, pointed flame which scintillated in the prisoner's eyes was only a gleam of what the border felt towards outlaws. While Jonathan was considering all he had heard, 3 more Shawnees entered the retreat, and were at once called aside in consultation by Ashbow. At the conclusion of this brief conference, the chief advanced to Jonathan, cut the bonds around his feet, and motioned for him to rise. The prisoner complied, to find himself weak and sore, but able to walk. He concluded that his wound, while very painful, was not of a serious nature, and that he would be taken at once on the march toward the Shawnee village. He was correct, for the chief led him, with the 3 Shawnees following, toward the outlet of the enclosure. Jonathan's sharp eye took in every detail of Legget's rendezvous. In a corral near the entrance he saw a number of fine horses, and among them his sister's pony. A more inaccessible natural refuge than Legget's could hardly have been found in that country. The entrance was a narrow opening in the wall, and could be held by half a dozen against an army of besiegers. It opened, moreover, on the side of a barren hill, from which could be had good survey of the surrounding forests and plains. As Jonathan went with his captors down the hill, his hopes, which, while ever alive, had been flagging, now rose. The long journey to the Shawnee town led through an untracked wilderness. The Delaware villages lay far to the north, the Wyandot to the west. No likelihood was there of falling in with a band of Indians hunting, because this region, stony, barren, and poorly watered, afforded sparse pasture for deer or bison. From the prisoner's point of view, this enterprise of Ashbow's was reckless and vainglorious. Cunning as the chief was, he erred in one point. A great warrior's only weakness, love of show, of pride, of his achievement. In Indian nature this desire for fame was as strong as love of life. The brave risked everything to win his eagle feathers, and the matured warrior found death while keeping bright the glory of the plumes he had won. Wetzel was in the woods, fleet as a deer, fierce and fearless as a lion. Somewhere among those glades he trod, stealthily, with the ears of a doe and the eyes of a hawk strained for sound or sight of his comrades' captors. When he found their trail, he would stick to it as the wolf to that of a bleeding buck's. The rescue would not be attempted until the right moment, even though that came within rifle shot of the Shawnee encampment. Wonderful as his other gifts was the borderman's patience. End of chapter 13. Of the Lost Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey, Chapter 14. "Good morning, Colonel Zane," said Helen cheerily, coming into the yard where the colonel was at work. "Did Will come over this way?" "I reckon you'll find him if you find Betty," replied Colonel Zane dryly. "Come to think of it, that's true," Helen said, laughing. "I have a suspicion Will ran off from me this morning." "He and Betty have gone nutting." "I declare, it's mean of Will," Helen said petulantly. "I have been wanting to go so much, and both he and Betty promised to take me." "Say, Helen, let me tell you something," said the colonel, resting on his spade and looking at her quizzically. "I told them we hadn't had enough frost yet to ripen hickory nuts and chestnuts, but they went anyhow. Will did remember to say if you came along to tell you he'd bring the colored leaves you wanted." "How extremely kind of him. I've a mind to follow them." "Now, see here, Helen, it might be a right good idea for you not to," returned the colonel, with a twinkle and a meaning in his eye. "Oh, I understand. How singularly dull I've been." "It's this way. We're mighty glad to have a fine young fellow like Will come along and interest Betty. Lord knows we had a time with her after Alfred died. She's just beginning to brighten up now, and Helen, the point is that young people on the border must get married. No, my dear, you needn't laugh. You'll have to find a husband same as the other girls. It's not here as it was back east, where a lass might have her fling, so to speak, and take her time choosing. An unmarried girl on the border is a positive menace. I saw, not many years ago, 2 first-rate youngsters, wild with border fire and spirit, fight and kill each other over a lass who wouldn't choose. Like as not, if she had done so, the 3 would have been good friends. For out here, we're like one big family. Remember this, Helen, and as far as Betty and Will are concerned, you will be wise to follow our example. Leave them to themselves. Nothing else will so quickly strike fire between a boy and a girl." "Betty and Will. I'm sure I'd love to see them care for each other." Then, with big bright eyes bent gravely on him, she continued, "May I ask, Colonel Zane, who you have picked out for me?" "There now, you've said it, and that's the problem. I've looked over every marriageable young man in the settlement except Jack. Of course, you couldn't care for him, a borderman, a fighter and all that, but I can't find a fellow I think quite up to you." "Colonel Zane, is not a borderman such as Jonathan worthy a woman's regard?" Helen asked a little wistfully. "Bless your heart, lass, yes," replied Colonel Zane heartily. "People out here are not as they are back east. An educated man, polished and all that, but incapable of hard labor, or shrinking from dirt and sweat on his hands, or even blood, would not help us in the winning of the West. Plain as Jonathan is, and with his lack of schooling, he is greatly superior to the majority of young men on the frontier. But, unlettered or not, he is as fine a man as ever stepped in moccasins or any other kind of foot gear." "Then why did you say that what you did?" "Well, it's this way. replied Colonel Zane, stealing a glance at her pensive, downcast face. "Girls all like to be wooed. Almost every one I ever knew wanted the young man of her choice to outstrip all her admirers, and then, for a spell, nearly die of love for her, after which she'd give in. Now Jack, being a borderman, a man with no occupation except scouting, will never look at a girl, let alone make up to her. I imagine, my dear, it'd take some mighty tall courting to fetch home Helen Sheppard a bride. On the other hand, if some pretty and spirited lass, like, say, for instance, Helen Sheppard, would come along and just make Jack forget Indians and fighting, she'd get the finest husband in the world. True, he's wild, but only in the woods. A simpler, kinder, cleaner man cannot be found." "I believe that, Colonel Zane, but where is the girl who would interest him?" Helen asked with spirit. "These bordermen are unapproachable. Imagine a girl interesting that great, cold, stern Wetzel. All her flatteries, her wiles, the little coquetries that might attract an ordinary man, would not be noticed by him or Jonathan either." "I grant it'd not be easy, but woman was made to subjugate man, and always, everlastingly, until the end of life here on this beautiful earth, she will do it." "Do you think Jonathan and Wetzel will catch Brandt?" asked Helen, changing the subject abruptly. "I'd stake my all that this year's autumn leaves will fall on Brandt's grave." Colonel Zane's calm, matter-of-fact coldness made Helen shiver. "Why, the leaves have already begun to fall. Papa told me Brandt had gone to join the most powerful outlaw band on the border. How can these two men alone cope with savages, as I've heard they do, and break up such an outlaw band as Leggett's?" "That's a question I've heard Daniel Boone ask about Wetzel, and Boone, though not a borderman in all the name implies, was a great Indian fighter. I've heard old frontiersmen grown grizzled on the frontier use the same words. I've been 20 years with that man, yet I can't answer it. Jonathan, of course, is only a shadow of him. Wetzel is the type of these men who have held the frontier for us. He was the first borderman, and no doubt he'll be the last." "What if Jonathan and Wetzel that other men do not possess?" "In them is united a marvelously developed woodcraft, with wonderful physical powers. Imagine a man having a sense, almost an animal instinct, for what is going on in the woods. Take, for instance, the fleetness of foot. That is one of the greatest factors. It is absolutely necessary to run, to get away when to hold ground would be death. Whether at home or in the woods, the bordermen retreat every day. You wouldn't think they practiced anything of the kind, would you? Well, a man can't be great in anything without keeping at it. Jonathan says he exercises to keep his feet light. Wetzel would just as soon run as walk. Think of the magnificent condition of these men, when a dash of speed is called for, when to be fleet of foot is to elude vengeance-seeking Indians. They must travel as swiftly as the deer. The Zanes were all sprinters. I could do something of the kind. Betty was fast on her feet, as that old fort will testify, until the logs rot. Isaac was fleet, too, and Jonathan can get over the ground like a scared buck. But even so, Wetzel can beat him." "Goodness me, Helen!" exclaimed the colonel's buxom wife from the window. "Don't you ever get tired of hearing Eb talk of Wetzel and Jack and Indians? Come in with me. I venture to say my gossip will do you more good than his stories." Therefore Helen went in to chat with Mrs. Zane, for she was always glad to listen to the colonel's wife, who was so bright and pleasant, so helpful and kindly in her womanly way. In the course of their conversation, which drifted from weaving linsey, Mrs. Zane's occupation at the time, to the costly silks and satins of remembered days, and then to matters of more present interest, Helen spoke of Colonel Zane's hint about Will and Betty. "Isn't Eb a terror? He's the worst matchmaker you ever saw," declared the colonel's good spouse. "There's no harm in that." "No, indeed, it's a good thing, but he makes me laugh, and Betty, he sets her furious." "The colonel said he had designs on me." "Of course he has. Dear old Eb! How'd he love to see you happily married. His heart is as big as that mountain yonder. He has given this settlement his whole life." "I believe you. He has such interest, such zeal for everybody. Only the other day he was speaking to me of Mr. Mordaunt, telling how sorry he was for the Englishman, and how much he'd like to help him. It does seem a pity a man of Mordaunt's blood and attainments should sink to utter worthlessness." "Yes, 'tis a pity for any man, blood or no, and the world's full of such wrecks. I always liked that man's looks. I never had a word with him, of course, but I've seen him often, and something about him appealed to me. I don't believe it was just his handsome face. Still, I know women are susceptible that way." "I, too, liked him once as a friend," said Helen feelingly. "Well, I'm glad he's gone." "Gone?" "Yes. He left Fort Henry yesterday. He came to say good-bye to me, and except for his pale face and trembling hands, was much as he used to be in Virginia. Said he was going home to England, and wanted to tell me he was sorry for all he'd done to make Papa and me suffer. Drink had broken him, he said, and surely he looked a broken man. I shook hands with him, and then slipped upstairs and cried." "Poor fellow," sighed Mrs. Zane. "Papa said he left Fort Pitt with one of Metzar's men as a guide." "Then he didn't take the little cuss, as Eb calls his man Case?" "No. If I remember rightly, Papa said Case wouldn't go. I wish he had. He's no addition to our village." Voices outside attracted their attention. Mrs. Zane glanced from the window and said, "There come Betty and Will." Helen went on the porch to see her cousin and Betty entering the yard, and Colonel Zane once again leaning on his spade. "Gather any hickory nuts from birch or any other kind of trees?" asked the colonel grimly. "No," replied Will cheerily. "The shells haven't opened yet." "Too bad. The frost is so backward," said Colonel Zane with a laugh. "But I can't see it makes any difference." "Where are my leaves?" asked Helen, with a smile and a nod to Betty. "What leaves?" inquired the young woman, plainly mystified. "Why, the autumn leaves. Will promised to gather with me, then changed his mind and said he'd bring them." "I forgot," Will replied a little awkwardly. Colonel Zane coughed, and then catching Betty's glance, which had begun to flush, he plied his spade vigorously. Betty's face had colored warmly at her brother's first question. It toned down slightly when she understood that he was not going to tease her as usual, and suddenly, as she looked over his head, it paled white as snow. "Eb, look down the lane!" she cried. Two tall men were approaching with labored tread, one half supporting his companion. "Wetzel! Jack! And Jack's hurt!" cried Betty. "My dear, be calm," said Colonel Zane, in that quiet tone he always used during moments of excitement. He turned toward the borderman and helped Wetzel lead Jonathan up the walk into the yard. From Wetzel's clothing water ran. His long hair was disheveled, his aspect frightful. Jonathan's face was white and drawn. His buckskin hunting coat was covered with blood, and the hand which he held tightly against his left breast showed dark red stains. Helen shuddered, almost fainting. She leaned against the porch, too horrified to cry out, with contracting heart and a chill stealing through her veins. "Jack! Jack!" cried Betty in agonized appeal. "Betty, it's nothin'," said Wetzel. "Now, Betts, don't be scared of a little blood," Jonathan said, with a faint smile flirting across his haggard face. "Bring water, shears, and some linsey cloth," added Wetzel, as Mrs. Zane came running out. "Come inside," cried the colonel's wife, as she disappeared again immediately. "No," replied the borderman, removing his coat, and with the assistance of his brother he unlaced his hunting shirt, pulling it down from a wounded shoulder. A great gory hole gaped just beneath his left collar bone. Although stricken with fear when Helen saw the bronze massive shoulder, the long powerful arm with its cords of muscles playing under the brown skin, she felt a thrill of admiration. "Just missed the lung," said Mrs. Zane. "Eb, no bullet ever made that hole." Wetzel washed the bloody wound, and placing on it a wad of leaves he took from his pocket,
bound up the shoulder tightly. "What made that hole?" asked Colonel Zane. Wetzel lifted the quiver of arrows Jonathan had laid on the porch, and selecting one, handed it to the colonel. The flint head and a portion of the shaft were stained with blood. "The Shawnee!" exclaimed Colonel Zane. Then he led Wetzel aside, and began conversing in low tones, while Jonathan, with Betty holding his arm, ascended the steps and went within the dwelling. Helen ran home, and once in her room gave vent to her emotions. She cried because of fright, nervousness, relief, and joy. Then she bathed her face, tried to rub some color into her pale cheeks, and set about getting dinner as one in a trance. She could not forget that broad shoulder with its frightful wound. What a man Jonathan must be to receive a blow like that and live. Exhausted, almost spent, had been his strength when he reached home. Yet how calm and cool he was! What would she not have given for the faint smile that shone in his eyes? For Betty? That afternoon was long for Helen. When at last supper was over, she changed her gown, and asking Will to accompany her, went down the lane toward Colonel Zane's cabin. At this hour the colonel almost invariably could be found sitting on his doorstep, puffing a long Indian pipe, and gazing with dreamy eyes over the valley. "Well, well, how sweet you look," he said to Helen. Then, with a wink of his eyelid, "Hello, Willie. You'll find Elizabeth inside with Jack." "How is he?" asked Helen eagerly, as Will, with a laugh and a retort, mounted the steps. "Jack's doing splendidly. He slept all day. I don't think his injury amounts to much, at least not for such as him or Wetzel. It would have finished ordinary men. Bess says if complications don't set in, blood poison or something to start a fever, he'll be up shortly. Wetzel believes the two of 'em will be on the trail inside of a week." "Did they find Brandt?" asked Helen in a low voice. "Yes, they ran him to his hole, and, as might have been expected, it was Bing Leggett's camp. The Indians took Jonathan there." "Then Jack was captured?" Colonel Zane related the events as told briefly by Wetzel, that had taken place during the preceding 3 days. "The Indian I saw at the spring carried that bow Jonathan brought back. He must have shot the arrow. He was a magnificent savage. He was indeed a great and a bad Indian, one of the craftiest spies who ever stepped in moccasins. But he lies quiet now on the moss and the leaves. Ben Liggett will never find another runner like that Shawnee. Let's go indoors." He led Helen into the large living room, where Jonathan lay on a couch, with Betty and Will sitting beside him. The colonel's wife and children, Silas, Zane, and several neighbors were present. "Here, Jack, is a lady inquiring after your health. Betts, this reminds me of the time Isaac came home wounded, after his escape from the Hurons. Strikes me he and his Indian bride should be about due here on a visit." Helen forgot everyone except the wounded man lying so quiet and pale upon the couch. She looked down upon him with eyes strangely dilated and darkly bright. "How are you?" she asked softly. "I'm all right, thank you, lass," answered Jonathan. Colonel Zane contrived with inevitable skill to get Betty, Will, Silas, Bessie, and the others interested in some remarkable news he had just heard or made up, and this left Jonathan and Helen comparatively alone for the moment. The wise old colonel thought perhaps this might be the right time. He saw Helen's face as she leaned over Jonathan, and that was enough for him. He would have taxed his ingenuity to the utmost to keep the others away from the young couple. "I was so frightened," murmured Helen. "Why?" asked Jonathan. "Oh, you looked so deathly, the blood and that awful wound." "It's nothing, lass." Helen smiled down upon him. Whether or not the hurt amounted to anything in the borderman's opinion, she knew from his weakness and his white drawn face that the strain of the march home had been fearful. His dark eyes held now nothing of the coldness and glitter so natural to them. They were weary, almost sad. She did not feel afraid of him now. He lay there so helpless, his long, powerful frame as quiet as a sleeping child. Hitherto an almost indefinable antagonism in him
had made itself felt. Now there was only gentleness, as of a man too weary to fight longer. Helen's heart swelled with pity and tenderness and love. His weakness affected her as had never his strength. With an involuntary gesture of sympathy she placed her hand softly on his. Jonathan looked up at her with eyes no longer blind. Pain had softened him. For the moment he felt carried out of himself, as it were, and saw things differently. The melting tenderness of her gaze, the glowing softness of her face, the beauty bewitched him. And beyond that a sweet, impelling gladness stirred within him and would not be denied. He thrilled as her fingers lightly, timidly touched his, and opened his broad hand to press hers closely and warmly. "Lass," he whispered with a huskiness and unsteadiness unnatural to his deep voice. Helen bent her head closer to him. She saw his lips tremble and his nostrils dilate, but an unutterable sadness shaded the brightness in his eyes. "I love you." The low whisper reached Helen's ears. She seemed to float dreamily away to some beautiful world, with the music of those words ringing in her ears. She looked at him again. Had she been dreaming? No, his dark eyes met hers with a love that he could no longer deny. An exquisite emotion, keen, strangely sweet and strong, yet terrible with sharp pain, pulsated through her being. The revelation had been too abrupt. It was so wonderfully different from what she had ever dared hope. She lowered her head, trembling. The next moment she felt Colonel Zane's hand on her chair, and heard him say in a cheery voice, "Well, well, see here, lass, you mustn't make Jack talk too much. See how white and tired he looks." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Last Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. The Last Trail by Zane Grey. Chapter 15. In 48 hours Jonathan Zane was up and about the cabin as though he had never been wounded. The third day he walked to the spring. In a week he was waiting for Wetzel, ready to go on the trail. On the 8th day of his enforced idleness, as he sat with Betty and the colonel in the yard, Wetzel appeared on the ridge east of the fort. Soon he rounded the stockade fence and came straight toward them. To Colonel Zane and Betty, Wetzel's expression was terrible. The stern kindliness, the calm, tough, cold gravity of his countenance, as they usually saw it, had disappeared. Yet it showed no trace of his unnatural passion to pursue and slay. No doubt that terrible instinct, or lust, was at white heat, but it wore a mask of impenetrable stone-gray gloom. Wetzel spoke briefly after telling Jonathan to meet him at sunset on the following day at a point 5 miles up the river. He reported to the colonel that Legget with his band had left their retreat, moving southward, apparently on a marauding expedition. Then he shook hands with Colonel Zane and turned to Betty. "Good-bye, Betty," he said in his deep, sonorous voice. "Good-bye, Lou," answered Betty slowly, as if surprised. "God save you," she added. He shouldered his rifle and hurried down the lane, halting before entering the thicket that bounded the clearing, to look back at the settlement. In another moment his dark figure had disappeared among the bushes. "Betts, I've seen Wetzel go like that hundreds of times, though he never shook hands before. But I feel sort of queer about it now. Wasn't he strange?" Betty did not answer until Jonathan, who had started to go within, was out of hearing. Lou looked and acted the same the morning he struck Miller's trail. Betty replied in a low voice, "I believe, despite his indifference to danger, he realizes that the chances are greatly against him, as they were when he began the trailing of Miller, certain it would lead him into Girty's camp. Then I know Lou has an affection for all of us, though it is never shown in ordinary ways. I pray he and Jack will come home safe. This is a bad trail they're taking up, the worst.
perhaps, in border warfare," said Colonel Zane gloomily. "Did you notice how Jack's face darkened when his comrade came? Much of this borderman's life of his is due to Wetzel's influence." "Eb, I'll tell you one thing," returned Betty, with a flash of her old spirit. "This is Jack's last trail." "Why do you think so?" "If he doesn't return he'll be gone the way of all bordermen. But if he comes back once more he'll never get away from Helen." "Ugh!" exclaimed Zane, venting his pleasure in characteristic Indian way. "That night after Jack came home wounded," continued Betty, "I saw him, as he lay on the couch, gaze at Helen. Such a look! Eb, she has won." "I hope so, but I fear, replied her brother gloomily. "If only he returns. That's the thing, Betts. Be sure he sees Helen before he goes away." "I shall try. Here he comes now," said Betty. "Hello, Jack!" cried the colonel, as his brother came out in somewhat of a hurry. "What have you got? By George, it's that blamed arrow the Shawnee shot into you. Where are you going with it? What the deuce? Say, Betts, eh?" Betty had given him a sharp little kick. The borderman looked embarrassed. He hesitated and flushed. Evidently he would have liked to avoid his brother's question, but the inquiry came direct. Dissimulation with him was impossible. "Helen wanted this, and I reckon that's where I'm going with it," he said finally, and walked away. "Eb, you're stupid!" exclaimed Betty. "Hang it! Who'd have thought he was going to give her that blamed bloody arrow?" As Helen ushered Jonathan for the first time into her cozy little sitting room, her heart began to thump so hard she could hear it. She had not seen him since the night he whispered the words which gave such happiness. She had stayed at home, thankful beyond expression to learn every day of his rapid improvement, living in the sweetness of her joy, and waiting for him. And now as he had come, so dark, so grave, so unlike a lover to woo, that she felt a chill steal over her. "I'm so glad you've brought the arrow," she faltered, "for, of course, coming so far means that you're well once more." "You asked me for it, and I've fetched it over. Tomorrow I'm off on a trail I may never return from," he answered simply, and his voice seemed cold. An immeasurable distance stretched once more between them. Helen's happiness slowly died. "Thank you," she said with a voice that was tremulous despite all her efforts. "It's not much of a keepsake." "I did not ask for it as a keepsake, but because I wanted it. I need nothing tangible to keep alive my memory. A few words whispered to me not many days ago will suffice for remembrance. Or did I dream them?" Bitter disappointment almost choked Helen. This was not the gentle, soft-voiced man who had said he loved her. It was the indifferent borderman. Again he was the embodiment of his strange, quiet woods. Once more he seemed the comrade of the cold, inscrutable Wetzel. "No, lass, I reckon you didn't dream," he replied. Helen swayed from sick bitterness and a suffocating sense of pain back to her old, sweet, joyous, tumultuous heart-throbbing. "Tell me if I didn't dream," she said softly, her face flashing warm again. She came close to him and looked up with all her heart in her great dark eyes, and love trembling on her red lips. Calmness deserted the borderman after one glance at her. He paced the floor, twisted and clasped his hands, while his eyes gleamed. "Lass, I'm only human," he cried hoarsely, facing her again. But only for a moment did he stand before her. But it was long enough for him to see her shrink a little, the gladness in her eyes giving way to uncertainty and a fugitive hope. Suddenly he began to pace the room again, and to talk incoherently. With the flow of words he gradually grew calmer, and with something of his natural dignity spoke more rationally. "I said I loved you, and it's true. But I didn't mean to speak. I oughtn't have done it. Something made it so easy, so natural like. I'd have died before letting you know. if any idea had come to me of what I was saying. I've fought this feeling for months. I allowed myself to think of you at first, and there's the wrong. I went on a trail with your big eyes pictured in my mind, and before I dreamed of it, you'd crept into my heart. Life has never been the same since. That kiss, Betty said, was how you cared for me, and that made me worse. Only I never really believed. Today I came over here to say good-bye, expecting to hold myself well in hand, but the first glance of your eyes unmans me. Nothing can come of it, lass. Nothing but trouble. Even if you cared, and I don't dare believe you do, nothing can come of it. I've my own life to live, and there's no sweetheart in it. Maybe, as Lou says, there's one in heaven. Oh, girl, this has been hard on me. I see you always on my lonely tramps. I see your glorious eyes in the sunny fields and in the woods, at gray twilight and when the stars shine brightest. They haunt me. Oh, you're the sweetest lass who's ever tormented a man. And I love you. I love you. He turned to the window only to hear a soft, broken cry and a flurry of skirts. A rush of wind seemed to envelop him. Then two soft, rounded arms encircled his neck, and a golden head lay on his breast. My borderman, my hero, my love. Jonathan clasped the beautiful, quivering girl to his heart. Lass, for God's sake, don't say you love me, he implored, thrilling with the contact of her warm arms. Oh, she breathed and raised her head. Her radiant eyes, darkly wonderful with unutterable love, burned into his. He had almost pressed his lips to the sweet red ones so near his, when he drew back with a start and his frame straightened. Am I a man, or only a coward? He muttered. Lass, let me think. Don't believe I'm harsh, nor cold, nor nothing, except that I want to do what's right. He leaned out of the window while Helen stood near him with a hand on his quivering shoulder. When at last he turned, his face was colorless, white as marble, and sad and set and stern. Lass, it mustn't be. I'll not ruin your life. But you will if you give me up. No, no, lass. I cannot live without you. You must. My life is not mine to give. But you love me. I'm a borderman. I will not live without you. Hush, lass, hush. I love you. Jonathan breathed hard. Once more the tremor which seemed pitiful in such a strong man came upon him. His face was gray. I love you, she repeated, her rich voice indescribably deep and full. She opened wide her arms and stood before him with heaving bosom, with great eyes dark with woman's sadness, passionate with woman's promise, perfect in her beauty, glorious in her abandonment. The borderman bowed and bent like a broken reed. Listen, she whispered, coming closer to him. Go if you must. Leave me. But let this be your last trail. Come back to me. Jack, come back to me. You've had enough of this terrible life. You have won a name that will never be forgotten. You have done your duty to the border. The Indians and outlaws will be gone soon. Take the farm your brother wants you to have, and live for me. We will be happy. I shall learn to keep your home. Oh, my dear, I will recompense you for the loss of all this wild hunting and fighting. Let me persuade you, as much for your sake as for mine. For you are my heart and soul and life. Go out upon your last trail, Jack. Come back to me. And let Wetzel go, always alone? He is different. He lives only for revenge. What are these poor savages to you? You have a nobler life opening. Lass, I can't give him up. You need not, but give up this useless seeking of adventure that you know is half a borderman's life. Give it up, Jack. If not for your own, then for my sake. No, never. I can't. I won't be a coward. After all these years, I won't desert him. No. Do not say more, she pleaded, stealing closer to him until she was against his breast. She slipped her arms around his neck.
For love, and more than life, she was fighting now. "Good-bye, my love." She kissed him, a long, lingering pressure of her soft, full lips on his. "Dearest, do not shame me further. Dearest Jack, come back to me, for I love you." She released him and ran sobbing from the room. Unsteady as a blind man, he groped for the door, found it, and went out. End of chapter 15.